You're listening to The Pipeline, the Western Standards National Affairs program, recording this Wednesday, February 5th, 2020. Each week we break down the issues, discuss them in depth, and examine some of the broader implications for Western Canada and beyond. Featuring from Calgary, the Western Standards publisher, Derek Fildebrandt. Good day, Derek.
Good day.
And Dave Naylor from Calgary, our news editor at the Western Standard. How are you doing, Dave?
Good, Paul. Beautiful downtown Abbotsford this week.
All right. Change of scenery, the other side of the mountains, as they say. And your host today is myself, digital editor Paul Holmes, coming to you live from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, on the water of the Pacific Ocean. Today, we're going to talk about media licensing in Canada. What the... We're going to talk about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the dismissal of the latest lawsuit, and as time permits, we're going to talk about a little bit of U.S. Politics, because it was just dominating the news cycle here in Canada with the Iowa Caucus, the State of the Union, and of course, Trump's approval rating being at an all-time high. So we'll talk about that as time permits. But first of all, before we dive into any of that, just wanted to remind everybody that we are a membership-driven news and commentary and organization, and we really need people to sign up so that we can continue to bring you amazing things. Obviously, the news on the website and great improvements and expansion of the podcast network as well. So go to westernstandardonline.com and click on sign up to become a member and help keep us on the air, as they used to say. So let's dive right in. Media licensing in Canada. Derek, I'm going to go straight to you on this one, because I feel like you have a few opinions on this.
Yeah, it's
Over to you, Dave. Why don't you set this up for us?
Well, I think we have to give Derek a few moments to collect his thoughts. And
I need to compose myself here.
It's the rage in his eyes. I can't see what's happening here.
Canada's Heritage Minister, Paul, on the weekend. This is a guy that 99 out of 100 Canadians couldn't pick out of a police lineup. Came out and was musing that, hey, maybe it's time for the government to start licensing media outlets. Of course, that set off an immediate firestorm across all of Canada, mainly amongst all the actual media people. They went berserk, and the minister was forced to do a bit of a back crawl on Monday when he met the media. But it was too late. The damage was done, as Derek is about to tell you.
Derek, media licensing. What's the problem?
Well, generally non-totalitarian states do not require the media to have licensing to be able to participate in public debate and news. So this came out of a very long and extensive report from the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission. A generally terrible organization to begin with that does all sorts of things, restricting the free press already in Canada in different forms of licensing, primarily for the traditional old telecoms. And the CRTC has been itching for decades now to sink its claws into other forms of media, particularly as online media. And media, broadly speaking, both news, opinion, and entertainment, has begun to dominate everything from Netflix to the Western Standard. And they released in these recommendations some pretty startling findings that you would not expect to see outside of the Politburo of the Soviet Union. And what really grabbed everybody's attention, and there was a lot of terrible stuff in there, but what really grabbed people's attention was their recommendation to the government that all media in Canada, big and small, be required to be licensed by the government, and that the government would set standards around content. Not that the government would be necessarily dictating word for word what everybody would be printing or speaking about, but that it would be holding the media to account, rather than media holding government to account, that the government will hold media to account for what they say is truthfulness and journalistic standards, etc. This is the kind of stuff that you see exclusively in the domain of totalitarian states. We already have all sorts of wild restrictions placed on free speech in Canada and many Western countries, but this was going to a whole new level, and it had very predictable outrage that came from it. Days later, the minister seemed to try and walk back his comments. There didn't really seem to be much way for it. Even the left-wing press thought that this was a bridge too far into 1984. But in walking back his comments, he said, no, we're not going to require licensing of everybody in the media. But he seemed to maintain that they still accept the government's recommendations, that the government is going to be setting standards. And so what form this takes is still unclear, but it could take many forms, like the government producing itself a list of approved media organizations in different classifications, and penalizing or making it illegal to advertise with media outlets that don't meet government standards. So on the entertainment side, that could be making it illegal to do advertising for entertainment media that don't do CanCon requirements. Or on the news and opinion side, outlets like ourselves who couldn't give two farts in the wind about what the government thinks of us might say that it'd be illegal for people to advertise with us.
Right.
So they haven't defined, but his walking back of comments was strictly on the idea of licensing, but everything surrounding licensing and government control over the media, they did not walk back. So it's very ambiguous about where we stand.
So I think most listeners and certainly ourselves, we can come up with a long list of dystopian possibilities around what state regulation of media looks like. But to play devil's advocate a little bit, Derek, what is when you look at other industries, take the financial industry, for example. Financial industry has a lot of self-regulation and also has a ton of government regulation. And a lot of people think government regulation in that realm is good. It protects consumers, and I think in many cases, it's filling the vacuum of self-regulation. And is that maybe the problem? And Dave, maybe you have thoughts on this as well. Is that maybe the problem with journalism? Has journalism as a profession failed to regulate itself to a recognizable standard? And so the government thinks that this is their opening to come in, whether it be opportunist or whether they legitimately see a problem and want to solve it. I don't know if you guys have thoughts around that, as opposed to the dystopian other extreme. Is there some role for government?
Well, I was waiting for Dave, but I'll just say no. There is no role for government whatsoever. Period. Full stop. No asterisks. No fine print. There's no role for government. Period. Yeah. I mean, the apologists of this, the statists and liberal sympathizers, have said, well, you need a license to own a car. Why not a license for this? Well, I'm a bit of an extremist. I'm not even sure you should have a license for a car. But I won't go there because I know I'm in a very small fringe libertarian minority on that. Yeah. But what is licensing other than the government making something illegal and selling the right to do it back to you at a cost and with conditions attached? The media in particular is the free speech, and a free press is the pillar of any free society. Without that freedom, no other freedom is possible whatsoever. And what the government's proposing here is that the same people who lied and covered up the SNC-Lavalin corruption affair are going to be responsible for making sure that the press is truthful, that the press is honest. Mm-hmm. In the new media environment, media talk about themselves too often, but we're new, so we haven't done it too much. But I mean, not everybody in the press today subscribes to the press corps. They don't all subscribe to the big black tie broadcasters and journalism associations anymore. We don't, and many independent media do not. We don't have any interest in participating in that. We're not playing by the old boys club's rules here. And some players in that are going to engage in misinformation or outright lies and propaganda on the left and in the right. And that's frustrating to many people if you've been on the receiving end of that. But the answer to that would be strengthening laws around libel and defamation,
Right.
allowing people to take private action in the court to ensure that these kinds of mistruths are not out there. Instead, this is the government trying to be the arbiter of what is right and truthful. And I cannot think of a less credible body, regardless of what party is in power. I cannot think of a less credible organization than a government to ensure that the press is honest and truthful.
I'm not finding myself in disagreement with a lot of what you're saying. I'm the guy who has a problem with the government issuing marriage licenses. But Dave, you have a unique in this circle. You have a unique perspective as a journalist. Is there something that journalism needs to do to prevent this sort of thing from being perceived as a necessity?
Well, I think the key thing is to keep it out of the government's hands. To me, if you're producing journalism that nobody wants, that isn't being read, and that is considered fake news, the marketplace will decide your fate. People will stop subscribing to your newsletter or your podcast, or they will not go to your website. The government getting involved just is saying to me that the Canadian public is not smart enough to realize what news is and what fake news is and what slanted news is. And to me, you never underestimate the credibility of your reader.
Well, and of course, it's not even about competencies. It's about perception of corruption and perception of influence, right? Even if the dystopian reality were not what happened, the fact that the government would step in at all would open up question marks about, well, are they trying to influence the media? Even if they go to great lengths not to, it's going to be hard for them to avoid that kind of perception. So why would you want to even step into that quagmire?
This is the next logical step after the $600 million a year media bailout. Many of us, including many in the mainstream media, warned that this was government meddling in the media, that the media, those running the newsrooms, those running editorial pages, even if they don't want to be influenced by the prospect of government cash being dangled in front of them, are going to be unduly influenced by it. I mean, it's a tough business. The print guys are going out of business left, right, and center. It's difficult for even the alternative media to break in. We're fighting to do so, but it's not an easy battle. And the temptation to toe the government's line, to accept government cash, is going to be there. And they all warned, many of us warned that this was undue meddling, but they all dismissed us as conspiratorial kooks, believing that this is going to result in some kind of 1984 government control over the press. But we are now seeing what is I never actually imagined that it would get this far. And I am as paranoid about government as it comes, and I never believed they would go this far. So they backed down from direct media licensing, but I think they have every intention of going forward and finding other ways, as I said, around deplatforming and demonetizing through penalizing potential advertisers for non-licensed media or non-government approved media. Mm-hmm. They also might go, I think it was Dave who alluded to it here, they might require that Facebook put things on social media feeds if you're a non-government approved website, like Western Standard will be.
Facebook's already doing that. But using their own standard as opposed to a government standard. They've
many of
hired
Facebook's
organizations to try to figure out what's legitimate and what's not.
True, but many of Facebook's rules around that are under pressure from the U.S. government already. Yeah. And so they are self-censoring themselves and cracking down. The Canadian government might go further and much more extensively than Facebook already is. Surely there is fake news out there. There's a ton of it. Our grandparents seem to fall for it a bit easier, like Nigerian princes asking for money in an email chain. But some people do get duped by fake news. But the price of fighting fake news by government control over other credible media sources is just not worth the cost.
So the solution is the free market and better laws. Speaking of laws,
I always say less laws.
Fair enough. a better court system. Speaking of court systems, we had news about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the very latest lawsuit to try to prevent the construction, dismissed. Dave, fill us in on the details.
Well, not only was it dismissed, Paul, it was thrown out as far as the judges could throw it. It was a unanimous verdict, 3-0, that cleared hopefully what is the last hurdle for the TMX to go through. I think most significantly, the judges said that Indigenous people in Canada do not get a veto over these type of massive projects. So the small band of Indigenous groups that are fighting the TMX immediately filed to the Supreme Court for an appeal. That is unlikely to be heard because of the unanimous verdict in the federal court. So I think the only thing that's left for pipeline opponents now is civil disobedience. So I think the next thing we're going to see is people handcuffing themselves to the site in Burnaby, and you're going to have a similar sort of standoff like what's going on right now up in Smithers with the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So the next move will have to be, what do the RCMP do with these civil disobedience protesters? And that's going to be very, very interesting in the weeks to come, Paul.
Well, and for those who haven't been following the story, and Dave, feel free to chime in on this, all of this followed on a previous lawsuit where I believe it was the Supreme Court of Canada actually ruled that the government had not sufficiently consulted with First Nations. And as a result of that lawsuit, they went back and did, quite a rigorous consultation. But, there's obviously groups that are just determined, consult all you want. We want this thing stopped. And unless that's your answer, we're not gonna let up. Is that the background?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so many appeals and whatnot, it's hard to keep track of them all. But the federal government did go back and consulted extensively. And that's one of the reasons that the federal court threw out this latest appeal. So they really have no other cards to play legally. Even BC Premier Horgan has admitted there's no more he can do. So when you look at it, all that's left is civil disobedience. And I guess it's how far these protesters are willing to take it.
Derek, what do you think?
Well, it was a rare good decision from a high court. I'm generally unimpressed with the judicial philosophies of many of our high court justices in both the Supreme Court and the provincial Supreme Courts. But this was a solid decision that they couldn't have ruled any other way. What surprised me, though, is it was less a ruling and more of a spanking. They threw it out, and they threw it out hard. They accused these bands of posturing. That was their term. They threw them out, and they essentially said, don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Do not come back, that it was a nuisance. And very importantly, as you both have already said, they ruled that First Nations do not have a veto. And in many cases, what are we talking about when we say First Nations? Are we talking about full nations, individual bands and reserves, or are we talking just hereditary chiefs? Because many of the pipeline opponents are hereditary chiefs who are born into position and have no real legitimate role beyond being a mini Queen of England, and they claim to speak on behalf of bands when the elected councils are actually often in favor of it. And in many cases, these chiefs are taking money from foreign sources to oppose pipelines. It's very political. It's downright almost corrupt in many cases. But it was a solid decision. But it's very interesting now how this is going to play out in BC, as you alluded to with the Coastal gas pipeline. And John Horgan is now facing the exact same thing. I think Don Braid at the Calgary Herald had a really good column on this yesterday after the decision came down, that John Horgan is, none of us want to see the Coastal gas pipeline in Alberta not go forward, but there is a bit of schadenfreude that John Horgan is now facing the same kind of people, in many cases the exact same people, who do not respect the rule of law, and and he's pleading for people to respect the rule of law after he himself has bent it as much as possible for political ends. So But all of this is to say, I still think the pipeline opponents have won. Even though we've won virtually every Supreme Court decision, we've won the regulatory board decisions, and it is now technically going forward. And I do think the TMX pipeline will get built. I still think the opponents have won because they have forced the taxpayers to nationalize this pipeline at tremendous cost to the taxpayer that we will probably not recover. They have created such massive uncertainty in the investment climate that no one's sane is going to propose a major interprovincial pipeline in Canada again beyond the Alberta-Saskatchewan border. Yeah, so while this pipeline goes forward, I think in the long term, we have won this battle, but I believe we have lost the war because we have given these people far too much slack in believing they can use consultation processes as not consultation, but as a veto.
And I think you're right. I think this is the last great pipeline that's going to be built in Canada. No investor certainly is going to do another one. And, 50 years from now, it's not going to, none of this is necessarily going to matter. But, I think in the short term, let's just hope it gets built and gets operational without too much interference beyond the legal realm, which has been exhausted. But all right, well, let's move over just for fun to American politics, just so we can gloat as Canadians about our great electoral systems. The Iowa caucus results, we still don't have 3 days later, or 2 days later, the actual results. We know that Pete Buttigieg is slightly ahead of Bernie Sanders, and way off in fourth place is a fellow named Joe Biden. So I don't know. Why don't we just go around the table and give me your thoughts about the Iowa caucus? Who wants to start? Derek, you look like you want to start.
Well, I loved it. I had a screenshot. It was I think it was roughly 24 hours after the polls had closed, and it showed everybody at 0%. And I said, it's just the way I like my Democrats. None of them win. It's a bit of a cluster. I mean, I've spoken favorably of the American primary process in the past, but Iowa's actually not a primary. It's not a great inter-party democratic vote. It's a very archaic system where you meet in your local church basements and gymnasiums, and you literally stand in different corners to support different candidates, and you have people moving around the room and debating in real time till they meet certain thresholds. It's all very complicated. It sounds fun, and I used to live in Iowa. Funny enough, I think the average voter in Iowa is more powerful than the average politician around the world. I think
Totally.
if I had stayed in Iowa as a kid, I'd be a very powerful voter. They're the most powerful voters possibly on the planet.
And super engaged in everything political.
Yeah, I mean, it is
council meetings have thousands of people show up in Iowa.
But this all happened because the Democrats. The official answer is because they had a huge software meltdown with a new app they were supposed to use. But very strangely, it was captured live on CNN. There was a Democratic Party, essentially a poll captain who's there he was on hold for hours, and he was talking to Wolf Blitzer on CNN. And after waiting on hold for an hour or more, they just hung up on him. They refused to even accept his results. So they're on the surface, we can blame this on software bugs, but the more conspiratorial minded think that there's more going on. It's hard to say. If there is something going on, it would be to disadvantage the outside candidates from the whole point of Iowa is not actually that there's very many delegates at stake for the Democratic nomination. It's that it gives you that early burst of energy for outsider candidates. And the two who are virtually tied are Buttigieg. Can you say his name properly?
Buttigieg.
Buttigieg.
You be the judge. You Buttigieg.
Yeah, you booed the judge. And Bernie Sanders. Those are two anti-establishment candidates, although Buttigieg is not seen as extreme, but he's not the establishment favorite.
Right.
And neither of them get that huge shock of media for the outsider candidate that you normally get with an Iowa upset. Joe Biden dismissed it long before because he wasn't going to do well there. And Bloomberg wasn't even on the ballot there. So those are the two big establishment candidates. And so if you were suspiciously minded, you could say that the fact that there was essentially no results to give you that shock out of Iowa favors the establishment candidates, Biden and Bloomberg, and disadvantages the others. Either way, it's hilarious.
Dave, what do you think?
The big winner last week with the caucuses is Trump. There's no doubt about it. Iowa is all about momentum, Paul. Mayor Pete and Sanders now leave Iowa for New Hampshire with momentum. Biden, I think, is in trouble. He did very poorly in Iowa. As Derek says, he wasn't expected to do well there, but he's still coming out of there with zero momentum. There's talk about him having money trouble as they move into New Hampshire, but Mayor Pete will have an extra, spark in his step. And as I said, the big winner is Trump. I think Trump had the best week of his presidency. The State of the Union, I thought, was perhaps his strongest speech as president. The theatrics of Nancy Pelosi ripping up his speech behind him will enrage his base. And on Wednesday afternoon, he's going to be acquitted in the Senate with the impeachment charge. So coming out of this, Trump is on a roll, and New Democrats are having to deal with the Iowa fiasco and trying to figure out how to get out of that slump.
It really is the best week for Trump, for all the reasons you mentioned. And there's also polls coming out showing that he was at a 49% approval rating, which in Canada maybe doesn't sound, wow. Actually, Canada would be amazing. But
when he was elected the first time, Paul, his approval rating was into the 30s.
Exactly. Yeah.
Remember,
and
so 49 is
yeah,
pretty high for him, the highest he's ever been.
It's the highest he's ever been, and it's very rare for somebody this close to an election to lose with such a high approval rating, especially an incumbent. And so, so we might be headed for Trump's second term. And I really feel like the reason for that is Democrat incompetency and meltdown and division. They were so determined to throw, to throw out a bad meme, the orange man bad, just determined absolutely to get, Trump out of office. And I think they shot themselves in the foot with that whole, the whole impeachment thing, and then that being thrown out. And then I guess the other piece of it is, Trump, is not like, has all these character flaws, but most people seem to have just looked beyond that, right?
I had the displeasure of watching the CNN after speech show, and it was literally out of control, shrieking by every single one of their panelists, who are all Democrat supporters, but they were all yelling over each other to try and say how bad the speech was. It frankly looked ridiculous. Meanwhile, Trump is just rolling merrily along. I think most political scientists would say they don't see anybody in that Democratic field that is going to lay a hand on Trump in November.
Well, and I think you could break it down. There is that progressive wing, that would get behind Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And then there is the more establishment wing that would be happy with a Joe Biden, maybe a Pete Buttigieg, but certainly a Bloomberg. And I think all of those candidates are not going to please the people on the other side. Maybe Pete Buttigieg could be the uniter, and maybe that's what they're hoping for. But, he's progressive enough for the progressives and establishment enough for the establishment. But, if they don't figure out a candidate that they can all get behind, this is a done deal. We may as well just call the results today. Derek, any other thoughts?
Well, I think, I forget which one of you said it, but I think whoever did was correct that this was the best week of his presidency, at least politically for him. It's quite bizarre that an impeachment becomes a political plus for the person being impeached, but it absolutely has here. It, whatever you think of Trump, and I was initially extremely opposed to Trump during the Republican primaries. I only came around to him later on. Essentially, just I would have voted for the guy just as a big middle finger to the Democratic and political establishment.
I think that's why most people voted for him,
or at least a lot of those swing
a lot
voters.
of them. Yeah.
But he has his I mean, he still does his 2 a.m. Tweeting from the toilet rants, but his State of the Union speech, I thought, was a rare statesman-like event at exactly the right time. He doesn't do it often, and I wish we'd see more of it. But his State of the Union speech, which Americans do watch in pretty large numbers, was relatively statesman-like, particularly by Trump standards. And he played it well, talking about what he's accomplished and vision for the future. It wasn't full of politics. And I always sympathize with the other party leaders who have to sit behind the president and look polite. So Nancy Pelosi, she's a Democrat. She, as Speaker of the House, she has to sit there. And, she can't really clap along because she doesn't agree with it. She hates the guy. I don't really know what she's supposed to do, but her temper tantrum tearing up the speech, maybe it played well with the base that she's increasingly catering towards, but it looked like a hissy fit. The Democrats have looked like they just never accepted the results of the election and have always just wanted to impeach him, and this is just their excuse, so most people dismiss it. And what I think the real result of this is going to be is twofold in the next election. It's going to energize absolutely every Trump supporter and Republican to come out in massive numbers, because they know that the Democrats will just try to overturn the election. They will try to impeach him again the day after Trump is reelected. I guarantee it. They may even start it even before he's sworn in for a second term. But very importantly, and I haven't heard anyone touch on this yet, is that I think this is going to help Republicans to potentially retake the House of Representatives.
Totally. Yeah.
Americans often like to send a divided executive and legislature to Washington because it checks the power of one another. It's generally a positive system. That's why presidents often lose their House or their Senate in the midterms. I think there's a good chance that Republicans are going to retake the House in next November, because Trump is going to be able to make a very strong argument that even if he's reelected, the Democrats will just try to impeach him the next day, and this will be political games going on and on and on. And so you need to elect Republicans to the House to govern, rather than Democrats who will just continue to relitigate impeachment. So it's impossible to say how this is all going to turn out. The only way this can get any better for Trump, I think, is if Bernie Sanders gets the Democratic nomination.
And I think on all those points, you're dead right. The invigoration of the Republican base is going to hit those down ballot, all over the country, for senators and Congress and state representatives. We're going to see a massive Republican upswing just as a result of the president's popularity and that invigorated base showing up to vote. So I think you're absolutely right, and a lot of people aren't talking about that yet because it's hard to predict. But just by sheer mathematics, a bunch of people show up to vote for the president that wouldn't otherwise have voted 3 months ago. It's going to have some effect down ballot for sure.
The time between now and next November is going to be startlingly like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. The Democrats got there and there was nothing to sack, nothing to capture, and now it's a long retreat back with nothing to show for it. And I think by the time they get to November, they're going to be very demoralized.
Well, and just quickly before I go to Dave, this whole exercise with the impeachment, Nancy Pelosi came out. She said, we don't want this to be political. We want it to be bipartisan. They literally had no Republican votes, either in the House or the Senate.
Actually, while we're talking here, it was just announced Mitt Romney in the Senate will vote to convict Trump. But that's not very surprising. He's
not a fan.
To be fair, Trump was pretty mean to him, so there's a lot of personality there, and he's also he's a relatively liberal Republican.
You got one.
They're going to get one Republican, which will be an important symbolic vote.
Sure, the guy that inspired Obamacare. So we got that. But ultimately, all of the things came down to maybe poor decisions and character flaws. They didn't bring up any crimes, any misdemeanors, any of these things that you're supposed to convict the president of, and these they just didn't do it. And so you can dislike Trump all you want. You can think he has massive character flaws. You can think he made bad decisions. but are any of those really good reasons to impeach? And I think an honest person needs to take a step back and say, well, probably not, right? Over to Dave.
Impeachment's almost out of time, and I think so are we.
Yeah. Dave, final thoughts.
Pelosi didn't want to impeach to start with. It was a bad move, and they'll be running around 7 years from now still trying to impeach Trump and get him out of office after 7 years.
There we are. Well, thank you very much, Dave from Abbotsford.
Beautiful downtown Abbotsford.
Downtown Abbotsford. Derek coming to you from Calgary, myself, Paul from Victoria. Thanks for joining us this week. Remember to like or subscribe on or both on YouTube. And if you haven't found us on your favorite podcast app, you can go check us out there. For all the different places you can find us, go to westernstandardonline.com/podcasts or click on that podcast link, and you can find us on your favorite podcast app.